So, Paul, I read a paper of yours recently, although it's not a recent paper of yours. It's from 1990 called Marx, Machines and Skill. Can you tell us a little bit about this paper?
Delighted to. Great to get a chance to chat with you about such important topics. This paper stemmed from my time in France, and maybe if I give you a little bit of contextual background, it'll help understand the motivation and then the line of argument too. I grew up in Australia, dropped out of school, ended up in France, did graduate work, ended up working as a research economist for the French government for a few years. And for my sins, did a fair bit of work with the French unions too, kind of on the side of my work for the government. And so got quite deeply involved in the discussions within the union movement in France we're talking now, the mid to late 70s, at a time when the union movement was still pretty strong and maintained some degree of kind of offensive capability too. Lots of debate about the impact of technology on work, on the quality of work. More concerns about the quality of work and skill requirements than about fears of mass unemployment, as some folks talk about today with AI. I was struck by how much the French, in their own peculiar way, had taken up ideas that were quite congruent with Harry Braverman's ideas that were then very prevalent in the Anglo-Saxon world, in the Marxist left, socialist left. And in this work I was doing with trade unions, I ended up spending a lot of time studying banking workers, insurance sector workers, as well as manufacturing workers, as their firms absorbed new computer-based technology. I had a chance to look at this pretty close up in field work, as well as interviewing workers, talking with union representatives. And I was struck that there was a real contradiction between the discourse premised on the likely de-skilling effects of this wave of computerization and the manifest reality on the ground that, by and large, this was having very positive effects on workers' experience of work. Their skills were being upgraded. They were moving from less drudge jobs to more interesting jobs. I mean, all the claptrap that management ideologists kind of get a spout, there was a lot of truth to it when you talk to workers. And I thought this struck me as something of a problem for Marxist theory. If our fundamental thesis was that under capitalist conditions, technological change is going to be used as a weapon against workers and to drive skill levels ever lower, degrade the work process, de-skill workers of the necessary skills. If that's not comporting with reality, if the trends we observe, and then if you look at the data and you try to say, hold on a second, is this maybe just this wave of technology? Let me go do some research on the history of technological change and its impact on workers' skills. It struck me as really hard to sustain the argument that technological change was in general having this de-skilling effect. The people were premising their whole political strategy. They were trying to mobilize the working class in opposition to technological change. Just saying it that way makes its absurdity obvious. But these were still times of pretty intense politicization, and people's theoretical lenses blinded them to how badly off balance their assessment was, how badly off the mark their assessment was of the impact that technology was having on the actual experience of the workers who they were trying to organize. So yes, there are cases of de-skilling. And yes, workers, even if their own jobs might be improved as a result of technology change, out of solidarity with their colleagues whose jobs have been destroyed or de-skilled, right? You might well imagine mobilizing worker opposition, because clearly capitalists also do use new technologies often to de-skill and degrade work and harass work, surveil work, and all the rest of it. So yes, we can mobilize workers against those negative effects of technological change. But if you try to do it on the premise that the broad effects of technological change are to de-skill workers, people are not going to buy your critique of capitalism. There's something seriously wrong with your understanding of capitalism if you can't somehow absorb into your theory of its contradictory development path the idea that, notwithstanding all this variation in the effects of technology on specific work cases, if you can't absorb into your theory the idea that, notwithstanding all this variation, there's a long-term trend towards relatively more educated, more technologically sophisticated work, that's a problem for Marxist theory. So that's what this paper is trying to resolve. And as I read Marx, I thought I found in Marx a pretty compelling argument for the way technological change, even under capitalist conditions, was going to tendentially upgrade work and improve, increase worker skill requirements. And that's the pitch I tried to make in the paper. I tried to unpack Marx's arguments, in particular in Capital, to show how we could sustain our critique of capitalism as a fetter on the further advance of the force of production, as a immensely destructive mode of production, while maintaining this tendential upgrading argument. In fact, it makes the argument even stronger. It comports with the idea that the capitalism creates its own gravediggers. I argued in the paper, not because workers are increasingly de-skilled and dispossessed and angry and frustrated and revolt, but because they're increasingly sophisticated, educated, capable, organized, and can simply take over society, maybe through some sort of really a difficult transformation process, but we have a class capable of societal leadership.
Yeah, so this de-skilling thesis would seem to kind of go squarely counter to Marx's assertion that the capitalist productive force of capitalism create the scene for socialism take over. That there is a development of the forces of production, and one of those forces is, maybe the most important one, is the labor power itself.
Yeah, I think that's I think great that you put it that way, because I think you could summarize the more traditional reading of Marx as saying, yes, capitalist relations of production stimulate the development of the forces of production, but only the material forces, the means of production, not the human forces of production. The development of the material forces of production happens at the expense of the human forces of production. You could imagine Marx making an argument like that, and there are places where that was indeed the case historically, that's what capitalists were doing, right? And Marx, denounces those. But as for making that the general argument, I think that's not consistent with his argument. I think the richer, more fruitful reading of Marx is to find in Marx the simultaneity, of the two poles of this contradiction. On the one hand, capitalism is highly destructive of workers and the conditions of production. On the other hand, it generates a class of gravediggers through the cultivation of a class capable of leading society, not just with having an interest in leading society, but also having the capacity to lead society.
Yeah, and it seems also to be like there's this inherent link between the progress of capitalism and the inherent variety in the products and in the production itself and the skill level of the worker. This upskilling is it built into the progression of the forces of production. The variety of the skills is a function really of the variety of the production system.
Do you mean the specialization of those skills when you say variety, or do you just mean the heterogeneity? I'm not sure what you're getting at.
Okay, yeah, probably both aspects, to be honest with you. Yeah, so the heterogeneity of production, the different types of production, both the products themselves and the ways things are produced, requires a greater heterogeneity of the labor power, right? And this is just with the development of the force of production, that the labor power and the physical force of relations, the forces of production themselves are in this dance that must co-develop.
Yes, but I think you might paraphrase what you just said along the lines consistent with the more conventional reading of Marx, replacing your words, sort of heterogeneity or variety, with specialization. What you're describing is a process of progressive specialization. And that's often seen, consistent with some of Marx's writing, as implying a degradation of the workers' individual capacities, because they're, narrowed down, they're reduced to a tiny slither of repetitive motions, right? But that's not the only form that specialization takes. Specialization also takes a form much more compatible with workers' well-being and capacities. Some of us live in a university environment where we have people who specialize in hyper narrow fields. They're not any the less skilled and knowledgeable and capable for being microbiologists who work at the intersection of, X, Y, and Z fields, right? And the critical element here is the interdependency of these various specializations. That's what Marx describes as the socialization process, as each individual contributor to society's economic production becomes increasingly specialized, that they also become increasingly interdependent in the delivery of any particular use value. So we now have a collective worker composed of many different specialized workers. On one view, this collective worker doesn't experience any collective will at all. That's all that they're operating under the boss's command individually. But we know that's not an accurate characterization of the labor process. We know that in practice, if you work to rule, that's a form of strike action, right? If you only do what the boss tells you to do, nothing gets off the end of the assembly line. Nothing comes out the door. It's workers' cooperation, the specialized workers' cooperation in the workplace, along with cooperation with other specialized contributors, the engineers, the technicians, the support personnel, right? That enlarged collective worker is what enables this machinery to function. And yes, within it, workers may be specialized in ways that are destructive to the human capacity, reduced to mere fragments of a machine, etc. Right? But they may also take that specialization can also take a form much more compatible with human flourishing. And I think capitalist reality is a mix of the two, right? Tendentially, it tends to, in that specialization, create more depth than narrowness, I should say. So compensate for the narrowness with greater depth. And that's why we see, on average, skill levels increase, required training times increase, required educational background increase. That over the last century or so of capitalism, that's been the overall tendency.
And that tendency was even occurring in Marx's time, wasn't it? With I think in the paper you talk about how vocational education, the Factory Act themselves were starting to change the skills of the workers.
That's right. Yes, I was struck by this after this very famous passage of Marx's in Volume 1, where mechanical system reduces the worker to a mere fragment of a man and all. Marx immediately in the next paragraph goes on to say, but look, capitalism is already responding to this challenge for a more fully developed individual, as Marx says, by the introduction of these professional schools, higher education, the integration of work and education. All of this relatively underdeveloped in capitalism as compared with the real needs of society, but nevertheless moves in exactly that direction. And so some might say I'm extrapolating too much from this little passage of Marx, but I think my interpretation is much more compatible with the broader vision that he articulates. Maybe add one more thing by way of context. I think we do have to keep in mind that most of Marx's writings is taking place in the first half of the 19th century, which has now been well documented by economic historians as a period relatively sort of not much replicated in the subsequent history of capitalism, where over a period of 40, 50 years, workers' living standards really did decline as the factory system got on its feet and a mass of farmers and peasants from the neighborhoods, artisans were all, and children, women were all forced into these factories. The Engels pause, as it's called, in the income of working people, was very dramatic in the early part of the 19th century. And Marx and Engels, you can see it in the Communist Manifesto, in the earliest writings of Marx on economics. He really did think that workers' wages were going to stagnate, or just remain at really subsistence level, which was very accurate as a way of characterizing those first few decades of that century. But in Capital, and even in the earlier work as well, it's very clear that Marx has understood that there's a possibility for capitalism to grow and living standards for workers increase at the same time. Their real income can increase, even if income inequality is growing at the same time. It doesn't mean that workers' incomes are degrading. And similarly, put aside incomes and focus on skills, right? You can easily enough see why the development of capitalism, with all its strange dialectical complexities, might also require continuous, long-term progression of worker skills.
Yeah, Marx was against Lassalle's iron law of wages. That theory that the wages under capitalism will always tend to the minimum level necessary to sustain the worker. You mentioned the paper as well. Go on.
I can say one other thing, Tom, and perhaps one other thing, Tom, about this. Rereading the paper now in advance of this podcast, I wasn't sure I made the points as utterly convincing as I felt at the time I had made them. So I acknowledge that this is an interest, it's sort of an open issue. I don't claim to have definitive proof that this is the only way to think through Marx's perspective on all this. But I think it's a fruitful way of doing it. It opens up and what's striking for me is that this paper was written in a time when, as I said, the French debates about de-skilling were intensifying. Those debates were very intense in the Anglo-Saxon world around the Labour Process Conference. Not many people were articulating the point of view I was, right? But all this was really very much salient at the time. Interestingly, if you look back over the past 20 years, a lot of the participants in that debate have kind of shrugged their shoulders and basically accepted the proposition that I advanced, namely that at least over these past few decades, workers' skills have on average tended to increase. There's been so many more empirical studies, by the OECD, at the level of the EU, international studies. It's pretty hard to sustain the idea that de-skilling is the essential dynamic of labor under the capitalist mode of production in the face of all this mounting evidence. So I think this question of de-skilling sort of probably comes in and out of focus in discourse amongst leftists and progressives in society as a function of the sort of fluctuating frontier of technological transformation and the way different sectors of workers are being impacted by it. I often smile to myself reading more radical political economy work these days, because for many people this debate is now just old hat, and it's obvious that worker skills tend to increase. It's just an obvious fact of life. But for other people, the battle continues. so I'm glad we get a chance to talk about it today.
Yeah, no, interesting. You talk in a section there on craft work, the de-skilling in craft work, and what Marx had to say about that with respect to this.
Yes, well, definitely craft is the kind of locus classicus of the de-skilling argument for Braverman, as it was for Marx. It was the destruction of the role of craft in the production system. It's a tragic story of, you're talking about people who've spent decades reaching, levels of craftsmanship, that we admire when we visit the museums these days, right? And all of that displaced, decimated by the introduction of mechanical systems. A few points. One, these people were never more than a tiny minority, even of the working class. So yes, the destruction of their skills is, from a civilizational point of view, to be regretted. But it's not the general. It's hard to extrapolate from this tiny minority of workers who had this real craft status. And two, I think the more fundamental critique that Marx offers is in his discussion of Proudhon, who also lamented the destruction of craft. But Marx is scathing in his critique of Proudhon, and basically in his critique sort of sees craft in a bit the same relation to capitalist development as peasant production. In the manifesto, he talks about rural idiocy, by which he means the isolation of the peasant or of the rural worker in general from the broader general intellect, as Marx calls it, their lack of access to the broader culture and technology and science of their age. That isolation is contrasted with socialization, where the individual worker, where the local community, has access to this universe of scientific, technological, and cultural know-how, is embedded directly in it, is tied into it. And the craftsmen are interesting because there were networks linking craftsmen across different regions of Europe and even the United States as it emerged. But these are very narrow networks that rely on knowledge that's essentially generated by the same people who are doing the work. So that the tools are extensions of the human. So it's all very cozy, right? But it's not very propitious for advanced technology. At some point, the world of science and technology takes over the development of the tools and drives them along new paths of development that the craftsman doesn't have the nowhere to do. So it's very nice that I use my hammer and saw as a carpenter, and I, as a craftsman, I could probably even make my own hammer, or I can certainly sharpen my own saw in the old world of the artisan craftsman. But now I've got an electric saw. I have no idea how they create an electric saw. I do not understand electricity enough to design it. I understand electricity enough to use the thing carefully, right? So I'm connected to the world of electricity to understand that, but I don't know how to design this in the way that as a craftsman, I would have known how to design my own tools. So the world of, as technology advances, the tool itself becomes the starting point for further automation and development, not the craftsman and their own expertise refining the tools at hand. So now the craftsman is separated from the means of production. But the means of production are not separated from all workers. The means of production are the object of the efforts of lots of other workers, technical and scientific workers. And so where does that leave the craftsman? In a pretty sorry state. There's no doubt that he's been or she's been proletarianized. And so, yes, that's a big cost that capitalism imposes on this minority of workers who were real artisan craftsmen. But now a world of development is opened up for all the people who previously were entirely excluded from this kind of intellectual, cultural development that the craftsmen represented, who are now drawn into the work of the factory. And yes, initially as unskilled labor, but progressively their work becomes more complex. Their skills levels rise.
Yeah, so you mentioned in the paper how you think a lot of Marx's talk of this kind of contradiction between deskilling and upskilling is kind of hidden by his polemical tone.
It's one of the delights of reading Marx and Capital in particular, that he manages to weave together, some pretty complex theory and this wonderful polemic. He's a political actor, and in his writing is politically performative too. He's aiming to move people. And denouncing capitalism is a lot easier if you focus on its negative consequences for workers than if you focus on this thing that's sort of shimmering in the background, as a kind of background long-term trend. So in the in the manifesto, we get, these lovely passages about Capital's historic mission in advancing the forces of production and communication and transportation, all the rest of it. But Marx doesn't expand on that rhetoric all that often. He does often enough over the course of his work for us to see the thread here. But I think as a political actor, it's perfectly understandable that he focus on the negative consequences of capitalism, especially with all the variability in the impact of technology on workers' lives. It's makes a lot of sense for him to focus on the cost of capitalist development than on its long-term benefits for us all. And to be honest, given the period in which he's writing, the benefits of capitalist growth weren't all that visible to many workers. Right? It's a lot harder to sustain that argument, in the late 20th century or the 21st century over these last 50 years, where notwithstanding neoliberalism and austerity, right, looking back, over capitalism's history, let's say over a century, people are very conscious that no matter how screwed up our lives are today, we live a lot better than our parents or our grandparents. Now, what is true, I immediately have to add a caveat. It does seem like we're approaching a very strange moment in capitalism where these crisis tendencies have accumulated to the point where, indeed, children have good reason to doubt they're going to live a better life than their parents. That's a very novel historical situation. That's not been the situation up until very recently, and I think represents something of a real crisis point for capitalism as such. It's, clearly, whether it's Europe, or perhaps America. Perhaps I'm extrapolating too much from America, but the data in the US is pretty scary for young people who come to the conclusion that they're not even going to live as well as their parents. On average, about half of them are not going to live even as well as their parents. Another half will do a little better than their parents. But that's a novelty in the history of capitalist economic development, and I think a mark of a pretty severe crisis stage that we've reached. Whether capitalism can emerge from it, who will see? But it does seem like the massive wave of technological innovation post World War II, and it's the fact that it was somewhat shared prosperity, through the welfare state and all. That big wave of capitalist development is clearly long gone, and it's not clear that there's a wave of major prosperity ahead of us. Not in the capitalist West, perhaps in China.
Like in America, I think we have falling life expectancy for the last few years, right?
Yeah, but not in Europe. This is not capitalism in general. This is the peculiar degradation of American capitalism that particular data point reflects. And, it's just an astonishing situation to watch an empire crumble. But I'm not sure that speaks to the general trajectory of capitalist development. So, Tom, I should add, to your point of life expectancy, I mean, it is, one of the scandals of capitalism that our scientific prowess isn't being devoted to ensuring the health and well-being and longevity of more people across the globe, but all those benefits are reserved for a tiny elite. group. But notwithstanding, the reality is, child mortality is generally going down, lifespan's generally going up. And I think this is a nice example of our forces of production being further developed.
Getting back slightly to probably the debates from, maybe we would say from the past a little bit, you talk a little bit about the work of, I think, David Noble and his forces of production and critique it. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so Noble's work's been important, and the ideas carried across through a lot of strands of research subsequently, that power relations in the workplace shape technologies in their fundamental design as well as in the way they're used in the workplace. And Noble describes the development of computer numerical control machines as a replacement for craftsman-controlled traditional numerical control machines. And it's a compelling idea, and there's clearly many cases in which we see that a capitalist imperative to control, deskill, free themselves from the constraints imposed on the shop floor by workers, where clearly those motives shape technology. We're seeing a lot of that at work today in the design of AI tools, right? That are being clearly designed with the deliberate intent of simplifying and deskilling positions in many industries. Although more often, in reality, to automate the jobs out of existence rather than to deskill them. But yes, this question that David Noble raises about the role of power and politics in shaping the technologies themselves is an important one. And of course, to the extent that he's right, it blunts the kind of argument I've tried to make, that the forces of production have their own somewhat autonomous cumulative development trajectory that is what enters into tension with the persistence of capitalist relations of production. If he's right, and the trajectory of the development of the forces of production are in fact controlled by the relations of production, then there's no contradiction between the forces of production and relations of production. There's perhaps a notional one, right, that one might imagine the force of production evolving in a different direction that was more emancipatory, but that's not what we would call a real contradiction. It's certainly not what Marx seemed to have in mind, I would say. So I don't think David's case works well. As I was sort of studied his history of the development of CNC, I was struck by the fact that he never once addressed the fact, as best I recall, maybe I should retract that. I was struck by the fact that he had so little to say about the fact that CNC could produce shapes that were simply impossible for any human machine operator to produce. A CNC machine tool can do things that no human-controlled NC machine can do. And that these shapes, very esoteric shapes, were of considerable importance to the aerospace and defense industries, for which, whose funding was driving the development of this technology. No, I do not think it's an abomination that machinists don't look at a blueprint and work out themselves how to cut the metal to meet the spec. I don't think it's an abomination that there should be some software specialist sitting up in an office somewhere who takes that blueprint and tries to draft a set of machine instructions that are then communicated to the worker on the shop floor, who looks at them, tries to implement them, suggests changes to them based on his experience, and sends them back up to the software expert to read it. No, this is a division of labor. Yes, the craftsman has lost their complete control over the instruments of labor, right? In the case of NC, they never already had that. They were already in a pretty advanced stage of automation here. So, but yes, they're losing even more control over the instruments of labor. But this is not a degradation. This need not be a degradation of the machinist's work. And in fact, machinist skills have been on the upswing with the introduction of computer numerical control, quite the opposite of David Noble's contention, because in reality, that collaboration between the machinist on the shop floor and the parts designer sitting up in the third floor office, that collaboration is very important for the effectiveness of the shop floor operator. They don't always get the specs right. The machine instructions need to be adjusted. And workers' understanding of the machine, their understanding of the software, their ability to work with the coders to repair the software, this is all part of a machinist's job today. And so machinists are no longer just mechanical people. Now they're electronics people. So I thought arguably this would be an article worth writing up, just how badly wrong David's assessment of this particular case was. I did write a couple of papers on this, Jake, looking at and other people have followed up too, looking at the impact of computer numerical control on machining. And as best I have seen the results of that, it's pretty unambiguous that the effects have been positive on the skill level of workers and on the quality of their experience at work. I'm sure there's cases where it's been a terribly negative experience for workers, that and computer numerical control has in fact sort of left them just mindlessly tending machines. You know something, if you visit a factory and you notice workers mindlessly tending machines, you've stumbled into a factory that's not very well managed. You know, if managers aren't able to harness workers' intelligence and just have them sort of standing around staring at a bunch of machine dials, this is not an effective use of your labor budget. You better invest that money in some people who can do something about it, who understand enough about the system to help contribute to it, rather than just staring at a bunch of dials. So I think while there's cases where computer numerical control have had the effects that David's anticipated, the evidence seems to be pretty strong that overall it's had quite the opposite effect. Not the opposite, but this more interesting effect of socializing the work.
Yeah, like in, say, with AI, we take, for example, like the history of computers is that there are lower level types of programming, say, programming machine code, and then it gets abstracted to a higher level, to C, and then that gets extracted to maybe JavaScript, and then JavaScript, now all of a sudden you've got an AI interface and you can program that to do it, and it's just the skills are at a higher level of abstraction.
That's right. Yeah, so there were people who were just fantastic, machine code people, and their craft was obsoleted, and they were frustrated. No, they were, they moved up that hierarchy you described. So no, I think that's a nice example that you give, where automation certainly obsoletes some skills and some activities, but by and large has led to an expansion of workers' capabilities.